movie because their fans want to see that. Oh, this made so much sense to me. Main character syndrome. And as I thought about it, I thought, okay, it's the social media world. Oh, got it. But then I started thinking about it. And I remember what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9. There's nothing new under the sun. People have had main character syndrome all the way back to Genesis. And it occurred to me that even the disciples of Jesus were afflicted with main character syndrome. And that's the first group of people that we're going to look at tonight. If you have your Bibles with you, turn to Matthew chapter 20. And as we look at Matthew chapter 20, we're going to see this condition of main character syndrome. Matthew 20, beginning in verse number 20. Bible says, "Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus with her sons, bowing down and making a request of him. And he said to her, 'What do you wish?'" Here's just a little side part. How would you answer that question if Jesus asked you? What is it you want? She said to him, "Command that in your kingdom these two sons of mine may sit on your right and one on your left." But Jesus answered and said, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink?" And they said to him, "We are able." Now, contextually, this is right after Jesus has told his disciples he is getting ready to go to Jerusalem and he's going to be put to death. And in fact, in the very next chapter, Matthew 21, is when he enters into Jerusalem. We call it the triumphal entry, the last week of his life. So that's where we are. We are almost at the end of his life. And so we see James and John make this request. Now, if you go over to Mark chapter 10, you're going to see the parallel passage. And here's an interesting thing. Mark never mentions mom in this. Mark says it's James and John who went and spoke to Jesus. And so you might see that as a little bit of a contradiction, but I think we can solve that pretty easily. In the Bible, if you sent an agent to speak for you, the words that agent spoke were considered to be your words. And I think that's what's happened here. James and John have sent their mother to go speak to Jesus, and I can back that up because Mark never mentions her, but Matthew, in Matthew's account, Jesus never mentions, he never speaks to her. His interaction was with James and John. He understood that it was them that were asking the question. Now, as we look at this condition, we understand some things. Number one, these guys were opportunists. In fact, they remind me a little bit of the prodigal. You remember the prodigal? He goes to his dad and he says, "You know, Dad, I'm getting tired of waiting on you to die so I can get the inheritance. Can you just go ahead and give it to me?" Well, Jesus has just told them he's about to die, and they're going to Jesus and they're saying, "Hey, can we have these positions in your kingdom?" I want you to consider the two problems they had. Number one, they had an erroneous assessment of the kingdom. They believed, along with the other disciples, that the kingdom that Jesus was establishing was a physical kingdom. And I don't understand how they could be this dense, but they don't have what I have, which is 2,000 years of hindsight to go look at this. They were in the moment. But we're at the end of the ministry. And so they have for 3 years seen the miracles, and they've seen the healing, and they've heard the preaching and the teaching. I don't get it. But do you know that all four Gospels mention the doubts of the apostles even after the resurrection? And the last words that are recorded of the disciples speaking to Jesus are found in Acts chapter 1, right before he ascends up into the clouds right in front of them. In Acts chapter 1, verse 6, they say, oh, now is when you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel. They're still thinking it's a physical kingdom. And so what James and John are saying here is, hey, Jesus, we know you're about to die. Can you make us the vice president and the secretary of state for your kingdom? They didn't understand. But secondly, the other issue they had was that of an entitlement attitude. What made these guys think that they were worthy of even asking the question? And I can think of three things. The first two, you'll be with me. The third one, we may have to dig a little bit. It's possible that they had this entitlement attitude because they saw themselves as being with Jesus from the very beginning. I mean, there were 4 apostles, 4 disciples who were there from the beginning of the ministry: Peter, Andrew, James, and John. So maybe they thought, well, we've been here as long as anybody, we're entitled to this. Number 2, along with Peter, James and John were a part of the inner circle of Jesus. Those 3 got to see things that the rest of the disciples did not get to see. They alone got to see the raising of Jairus' daughter. They alone got to go up on the Mount of Transfiguration. They alone went into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, or to be with Jesus when he prayed. So maybe they thought that. But let me throw another wrinkle here. And it is a wrinkle that maybe explains why their mother approached Jesus. 3 of the 4 Gospels, Luke being the exception, mention women at the cross when Jesus was crucified. And what's interesting to me, and it shows the individuality of the writers, they don't name the women all the same. Some list 1 or 2 women that the others don't. But here's the interesting thing. Matthew says that at the cross with the other women was the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Mark doesn't use that phraseology at all, but he mentions a woman by name, Salome. John doesn't mention either one of those, but he says with the women was the sister of Mary. So maybe what we're seeing here is that Salome was the mother of John and James and was the sister of their mother, Mary, which would make her Jesus' aunt, which would make them cousins of Jesus. And maybe the reason they felt so entitled was nepotism. Now, I can't point to book, chapter, and verse that says that, but I'm just adding this piece to this piece to this piece, and that's what I'm coming up with. But whatever it was, these guys thought they deserved these positions at the left hand and the right hand of Jesus in his kingdom. They were infected with main character syndrome. But Jesus had a cure for that, and I want you to keep reading here in verse number 25. But Jesus called them to himself, and he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great or big among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first or foremost, think number 1 among you, shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. I'm going to trip over that. I like it being there, but I move around too much. So Jesus says, look, if you want to be great, you have to be a diakonos. And if you know your Greek, you know that's the word that we get the word deacon from. But Jesus wasn't saying, hey, if you want to be great, you got to become a deacon. Because the word diakonos literally means table waiter. Jesus is saying, look, if you want to be great, you got to be the guy who brings the food, takes the order, brings the food, and then cleans up after they're done eating. You've got to be a table waiter. And if you want to be number one, if you want to be foremost, if you want to be first, you have to become a doulos, a slave. Oh, wait a minute, Jesus. That's what I got to do if I'm going to be if I'm going to be left and right, if I'm going to be the vice president, if I'm going to be the Secretary of State, I got to do what? You see, the cure to main character syndrome is you have to learn to serve. You have to learn that the spotlight isn't on you, the spotlight is on someone else. That it's not about me, it's about someone else. And Jesus said, look, I'll tell you what, if you want to do it, this is what you have to do, because you're going to have to do what I'm doing. I didn't come to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. And isn't that what Jesus said to us? In Luke 9, verse 23, he said, if you want to be my disciple, take up your cross daily and follow me. Now, folks, you know as well as I do, you say that to somebody in the first century inside the Roman Empire, and they knew exactly what the cross represented. Jesus was saying, hey, if you want to be my disciple, you have to be willing every single day to give your life up for me. And thus we see the condition here in chapter 20 of main character syndrome, but then we see the cure. Now, let's take that. Two individuals, James, John, who had a passion for status. And let's lay them side by side, someone who had a passion for service. Turn with me over to the right, 5-6 chapters to Matthew 26. In Matthew 26, we're going to see an account that we read about in Matthew, in Mark chapter 14, and in John chapter 12. And all three of those add a little bit different details that when we put it all together, we get the full picture. But let's look beginning in verse number 6, because now we see the contrast between what James and John's attitude was. Verse number 6, now when Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly perfume, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. But when the disciples saw this, they were indignant, saying, why this waste? For this perfume might have been sold for a high price and the money given to the poor. But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why do you bother the woman? For she has done a good work to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. For when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken of in memory of her. Now, as we dig into this, let's think about about the context. Now, if we back up a couple of verses, we realize that Jesus has just told his disciples that in 2 days he is going to be crucified. And so that's where we are. He's going to be crucified in 2 days. You know what I find fascinating? Is there is nothing in the biblical record where they said, no way. We're going to put a stop to that, Lord. I don't read that at all. They just went on as if nothing was different. And so 2 days it's going to happen. And so Jesus is in Bethany, a couple miles away from from Jerusalem, and he is at the house of a man named Simon the leper. And he has been invited for a dinner. And that dinner, I believe, was a celebration dinner, because in John 12, we see that the woman here is Mary. John 12, verse 3. Mary, the sister of Martha, the sister of Lazarus. And what happened in John 11? Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. This is a dinner, in part celebrating that, but also note whose house it's at. Simon the leper. And you know as well as I do, in that culture, if you had leprosy, you did not socially interact with people who didn't have leprosy. You were outcast. You were ostracized. There is no way that Simon was hosting a dinner party if he still had leprosy. He had been cured, and the obvious and logical conclusion is that Jesus had cured him. And so this dinner is taking place, a celebration of the resurrection of Mary's sister or brother Lazarus, and of the healing of this man Simon. Now, I want you, as we look at this text, to consider the courage of Mary. Mary was a courageous woman, and she took some serious risks here. Risk number one, she risked ruin, financial ruin. This jar of perfume that she took, we learn in Mark 14, had a value of 300 denarii, roughly a year's salary. It was probably a family heirloom. It may well have been an inheritance. It might have been in part a retirement plan of some kind for the future. Whatever it was immensely, immensely valuable. And her taking that and pouring it on Jesus is, well, for somebody who doesn't have a passion for service, that would have seemed absurd. Now, if we were to put that in modern terms, I think, the last time I looked, I think the median family household income in America today is roughly $60,000. I may be off a little bit there, but you kind of get the point. How many of us would take $60,000 and just dump it out? I'd be hard-pressed to do that. But she wasn't. She was willing to risk ruin, financial ruin, for Jesus. Number two, she was willing to risk being ridiculed. Because the text says that the disciples were really upset about this. It says they were indignant. In Mark's account of this, it says that they scolded her. They were not happy with her. Now, John tells us one of the reasons why. John tells us that it was Judas who was the one who was scolding her. And John chapter 12, verse 6 tells us why. He was a thief. And he kept the money bag. And he used to dip money out of it whenever he felt like it. And when he saw that jar of perfume and realized what it was worth, probably went through his mind, boy, wouldn't that be nice to have in the money bag? And so she risked the ridicule. Now, you and I may not think much about that today, because we get ridiculed from time to time, do we not? But understand that in that culture, a very, very much a male-dominated culture, very much a culture in which women had almost no rights at all. They could be brutal, and they probably were brutal. She risked that. Number three, she risked her reputation. John 12, verse 3 says that after she poured the oil on, or the perfume on Jesus' head, that she wiped his feet with her hair. Now, if you just casually read through that, you might think, boy, she had long hair. I don't think about that, but you might think about that. But understand, culturally, Women in that period they bound their hair. It was bound up. And they didn't unbind it publicly, period, unless they were a loose woman, unless they were a prostitute. And so for her to unbind her hair in a public setting would have been an enormous risk to her reputation. Hard to imagine. But then number 4, she risked reality. I mentioned a moment ago that Jesus has just said, 2 days I'm going to be crucified. Disciples don't seem all that upset about it. She was upset about it. She was really upset about it. And she took this perfume and poured it on Jesus. And what did Jesus say? She has prepared my body for burial. She knew what she was doing. The disciples may not have been able to function. They may not have been able to put the pieces together. She knew what was happening. She knew, and she anointed his body for burial. And as much as she loved him, and she put, they call it today, she brought the receipts. She brought the receipts. She was willing to give up $60,000 in that time frame, a year's salary, because of her devotion for Jesus, because of her love for Jesus. Do you think the tears flowed from her and from her eyes as she thought through what was happening here with Jesus? I think it's true. I think it's true. And so she risked exposing herself to the grief in front of all of these people who were at this dinner party because she knew what was about to happen. And so we see in this woman courage. But notice what Jesus says in the last verse. We see a commemoration. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken of in memory of her. Well, here we are 2,000 years later, and guess who we're talking about? When you think of Judas, what do you think about? The betrayer? The one who stabbed Jesus in the back, so to speak. But when you think about Mary, what do you think about? You think about one who was devoted to Jesus. Notice the text says that when the disciples complained, verse 8, they said, "Why this waste?" But what did Jesus say? She has done a good, literally a beautiful, she has done a beautiful work to me. You want to talk about compare and contrast? Compare Judas in this room, in this dinner party, and Mary. One saw waste. One saw opportunity to do a beautiful thing. And so as we lay these two accounts next to one another, James and John, a passion for status, and Mary, a passion for service, there are lessons to be learned. And there is application to be found. And I want to ask you some questions here as we finish up this lesson. Do we have today in the church a John F. Kennedy view? Do you remember the famous line in Kennedy's inauguration address? Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. How do we view the church? Do we go, well, what's the church going to do for me? Or are we looking for ways that what we can do for the church? I spent a number of years at Jersey Village as a deacon, and then I was an elder, and as I mentioned to a sister earlier, they demoted me and made me the preacher. And in all those years, I spent a lot of time in the foyer meeting and greeting visitors. And I cannot tell you, and I'm sure all of your leadership here and probably most of you have encountered a visitor who asked you, well, what does this church have to offer for me and my family? Wrong question. The question is, what do I have to offer for this church? So many times we have the entitlement attitude of James and John, don't we? And instead of looking for the opportunities to serve, we're too busy looking for the opportunities for status. I don't want to embarrass anybody, John, so I probably will, but John just mentioned to me a minute ago, I said, I love your building. You guys, I go to a lot of church buildings nowadays because I'm somewhere different almost every week. You guys have the Bucky bathrooms of the churches of Christ. People should drive out of their way to come to your building to use your bathrooms. And I mentioned that to John, and John mentioned that you have a new janitorial service of a couple of your members and how they are going out of their way in cleaning the building. Isn't that what we should do? Isn't that how we should view everything there is to do, not just with the building, but with the church as a whole? How can I serve the church? It's a question that we need to ask ourselves in way of understanding what is our view of a passion of service. The second thing I would ask is, are we giving everything that we have to give? Do we seek to give Jesus the best we have? And I don't just mean that when the collection plate goes by, although that's part of it. But are we giving the best we have to give to the Lord? Are we giving the best attitudes? Are we giving the best time of prayer, the best time of study, the best we can offer? Because you know what? I got in this conversation the other day with someone, and the comment was made, well, we need to try and be more like Jesus. Can't argue that, but we'll never be like Jesus because Jesus was perfect. But do you remember what the Apostle Paul said? Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Jesus. Now, I can be like Paul because Paul called himself the worst of sinners. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 15. He wasn't a perfect guy. Well, I can be in that club real quick. But that doesn't mean I can't give. And Paul gave. And if you think about the way we give, it's really about an attitude, isn't it? I love Philippians chapter 1. Paul said in verse 21, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Is that my attitude? A couple of verses later, he said, I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is very much better. Folks, the only way that you and I can have an attitude of service and give and offer the best that we have is to have that attitude. And it's something we have to check in our spiritual mirror every single day. Where's my focus? We'll talk some more about that in our devotion time. Number 3, are we willing to be ridiculed, criticized, ostracized for our faith? You know, Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. He said somewhat the same thing in Revelation 2, verse 10. Be faithful even if it costs you your life, even to the point of death, and you'll receive the crown of life. Can we honestly look at our spiritual mirror and look and examine ourselves and say, I'm willing to take the ridicule, the criticism for Jesus? That's a hard thing to do, isn't it? Because we tend to sort of separate our spiritual life and our physical life. I even had a guy one time, I don't want to go too far with this, but he told me that, I'd offended him in a sermon that he took it as a political statement. It wasn't, but that's the way he took it. And I questioned him about it when he criticized me. And he said, well, there's our political life and then there's our Christian life. And I'm like, what? How do we separate that? And if we're going to stand up for Christ, if we're willing to be ridiculed, if we're willing to be criticized, well, we can't just go along to get along. We can't be like Pilate, who let Jesus be crucified. Why? Because he wanted to satisfy the crowd. Mark 15 and verse 15. We can't do that. We have to be willing. Several years ago, Lisa and I moved my mom and dad down here from Missouri. In Missouri, they recognize that the Cardinals are God's favorite team, but we're still working on that down here. And they were aged, and we brought them here, so they needed help. And my dad passed away in 2017, and he had bladder cancer, and it was hospital visit after hospital visit after hospital visit towards the end. But one thing that really stuck out at me is we're in Willowbrook Methodist Hospital, and my dad is going to have surgery with a surgeon that was one of the staff surgeons there, and I didn't know the man. And Dad is in the operating room with this guy, and we're in the room, and the nurse comes in, and I asked the nurse, I said, this is just so weird for me. My dad is in there, and I don't even know this person. I said, tell me something about him. And she's telling me this, and she's telling me that, and just out of the clear blue, she goes, he does this kind of funny thing. He sings hymns while he's operating. And I got to tell you, that hit me like, it was like a load off me. I was like, okay, I feel a whole lot better about this man. And after the surgery was over, and he came in and he's talking to us, I said to him, hey, the nurse said you sing hymns when you're operating. And apparently I didn't say it right, or maybe he wasn't used to someone approaching him like I did, because he was very defensive. And he looked at me and he goes, I'm not going to apologize for my Christian faith. And I'm like, no, that's not what I meant at all. It's not what I meant at all. And I praised him, and I was so thankful. I was so thankful that this stranger who had my dad's life in his hands was a person of faith. But I've thought about that ever since. Have I ever had a situation where somebody questioned me or criticized me, and I said, I'm not going to apologize because of what I believe? I don't know that I've ever been in that situation. And to be honest with you, I hope that if I was, I would answer it the way he did. I'm not going to apologize for this. This is who I am. And if you want to criticize me for that, if you want to put me aside, if you want to ridicule me, go right ahead. Go right ahead. Maybe you've had that experience. But I think about Mary, and I think about that risk that she took. And I'm impressed. I'm impressed. You and I need to think about, are we willing to put our faith on the line, even if it costs us something, because we are willing to be servants and have a passion for service? That's not going to happen unless you have a vision that is heavenward. And I want to close this lesson. John told me that the bell would ring at 20 till, and it's past 20 till unless that clock is wrong. So I'm going to wrap things up, and if I'm early, you all can just say amen and we'll be happy. I think that it's so critical and important for us to understand the words of the Apostle Paul in Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. He said, "If then you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your hearts on things above and not on earthly things, for you died." And he's speaking about being raised up in verse 1, which is speaking about being baptized in chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. "For you died, and your life is hidden in Christ." And here it is. This is it. This is verse number 4 is the verse that you and I should get up every day, look in our spiritual mirror, and evaluate, examine our faith. But when Christ, who is your life, but when Christ, who is your life, but when Christ, who is your life, is manifested, you will be manifested, revealed with Him in glory. You see, the question you and I need to ask ourselves every day, if we want to have a passion for service, is this one: is Christ my life? Is He important enough to me to risk financial problems? Is He important enough to me to risk being criticized and ridiculed? Is He important enough to me to risk my reputation? And if the answer to those questions is yes, then, like Mary, you have a passion for service. I appreciate your attention tonight. Thank you.